Dobro večer, dragi gosti, dame i gospodo. Mislim da možemo početi. Sve vas pozdravljam u ime Centra za obnovu kulture. Drago mi je da smo se okupili večeras. Prije nego što Robin predstavi našeg uvaženog gosta, htio bi par riječi reći o djelovanju udruge. Imamo velike planove za ovu jesen. Sinoć smo otvorili nove prostorije u centru Zagreba, u Tomašićevoj ulici, i gospodin O'Sullivan je održao jedno zanimljivo predavanje o stanju u Europi i šire. Mi smo, kao što znate, dio civilnog društva i ponosni smo što ne primamo ni jednu kunu iz proračuna, za razliku od drugih udruga koje su potpuno ovisne o javnom financiranju. Djelujemo već 9 godina i financiramo se isključivo od naših dobročinitelja i prijatelja. Znači, možemo reći da smo prava hrvatska udruga, imamo sve širu podršku i pokazali smo da je moguće opstati već skoro 10 godina bez državne potpore. Ove druge udruge, bojim se, bez obzira što se ne slažemo po mnogo čemu, ne djeluju slobodno, ne mogu djelovati u slobodi kao i mi, jer ne ovisimo o politici, da tako kažem, za svoj opstanak. Znate da u zadnje vrijeme riječ klijentelizam je ušla u mainstream hrvatske politike. Mi već govorimo i upozoravamo na tu pojavu gotovo 10 godina, tako da to je veliko zadovoljstvo da i mnogi drugi uočavaju probleme i pojave skrivene korupcije kod nas. Borimo se protiv toga, nadamo se da će se taj trud isplatiti. Evo, zahvaljujem još jednom što ste došli. Na našim web stranicama COK.hr možete vidjeti što predstoji i sve što planiramo ove jeseni. Tako da još jednom zahvaljujem. Robin, the floor is yours.
Sada engleski. This book has just been, which is not the subject of John's talk, but has just been presented by John to the Centar za obnovu kulture. And I'm just going to mention it because it is a translated version of a series of largely poetic reflections on the crushing of freedom in Hungary in 1956. One of the greatest tragedies and scandals in the history of the modern world, I think one could say. And is a reminder of two things. A reminder, first of all, that freedom is always more fragile than we imagine, because certainly those who rose bravely in 1956 did not actually expect the terrible consequences which occurred to them, or that the West would allow those consequences to occur to them. But also it is a little reflection on John himself. John was not fighting in the barricades in 1956, but John has fought on a lot of intellectual barricades, and on some of the same barricades as I have, so I know that he is of sterling material. But I first met John in 1980 when I stayed with him in his house in Washington. This was a house situated in one of those areas of Washington, if you know Washington, where no sensible middle-class person would live without a car. John did not have a car. I had come across John, however, at a distance, as it were, before that, because he was, and I'm sure always will be, an extremely funny writer. And he was writing the political sketches about the House of Commons in the 1970s. when we had, you will find this difficult to believe, an even worse Conservative government than Britain has today. To je moguće. Vjerujte mi, to je moguće. And what you could find from John's writings then, and what you will have found from his, looking through his curriculum vitae since, is that he is consistent, profound, never pompous, acute, immensely experienced, and funny. Now, this is an extraordinary thing to try to be able to tell people. I'm afraid I love Croatia, but I get to say this quite frankly, that there is a feeling in Croatia that in order to be serious and profound, you should be boring. Boring, boring, boring. But you don't need to be. And John is, as a conservative intellectual who has worked very successfully in America and in Britain, and now fighting for conservative values in Hungary itself. Wherever John goes, there's always some kind of trouble, and Hungary is in it now, but also not because of John, but I should say that no cause would ever find a more eloquent and courageous defender, as I know, than John O'Sullivan. I'm proud to introduce him.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for welcoming me, and thank you very much, Robin, for that much too generous introduction. I do not see how anybody could survive an introduction like that, because no one could possibly live up to it. But thank you very much. I want to just begin by saying something, responding to something Stephen said yesterday, and that was that his foundation, his centre, does not accept government money and relies on private subscriptions. Well, I would, first of all, I think that's a great statement of principle, but it can also be a very good basis for creating an organization. And I will tell you that the first time I joined such an organization was when I went to Washington for Heritage, the Heritage Foundation in 1979. And the Heritage Foundation did not accept the government money, and it insisted that any private money had got to be, it had a limit on the amount of large donations it got. It raised, I think, 54% of the money it got from small donations of less than $100. That turned out to be a great nuisance, of course, to administer such small donations, but it turned out to be a very important element in Heritage's growth and influence, because, of course, it meant that millions of people over America felt that they were members of the foundation, they had given money for it, and they kept in touch with it. And it built up a constituency as well as being a form of finance. So I think you may have made a wise or prudent decision as well as a principled one, and congratulations. Now, I want to begin by telling a story about Sir Thomas Beecham. He will not be as well known, I think, to Croatians, but he was a great conductor in England, and in the 1930s he was once at a party at which he ran in to a woman whom he vaguely recognized and knew he knew, but whom he couldn't put a name to. So as he was talking to her, he was casting out various questions that might perhaps give him the clue, because he was embarrassed by this. And he tried everyone until eventually he used one that had never failed before, and he said, "And tell me, what's your husband doing these days?" And the lady smiled pleasantly and said, "Oh, he's still the king." Well, like Sir Thomas, conservatives need to be reminded of ideas which they dimly recall, but whose power and authority they have forgotten. One of these ideas is conservatism itself. And I take it if I have a comparative advantage in this debate, it is that I've experienced not merely of British conservatism, but also of conservatism of both sides of the Atlantic, and now, of course, for the last 10 years in Central Europe. But it's in America that I want to begin a brief overview of why conservatism currently seems to be in difficult times. If we go back, when the so-called new conservatism of William Buckley and Russell Kirk emerged in the middle 1950s, it came in for a great deal of mystified criticism. Could there be such a thing as a genuine conservatism in a nation steeped in Lockean liberalism as the United States was? And in the United States, such questions provoked a powerful essay on conservatism as an ideology in the American Political Science Review by Professor Samuel Huntington, then a young scholar, now famous more recently as the prophet of the class of civilizations. Professor Huntington looked at 4 eruptions of conservative thought in history: the European reaction to the Reformation, to the French Revolution, and to the 19th century campaign for an extension of the franchise, and finally to the rise of the slave-holding South, and finally the reaction of the slave-holding South to the rise of abolitionism. And against those 4 historical cases, he examined 3 theories of conservatism. From this examination, he concluded that conservatism was not a narrowly specific ideology justifying aristocratic resistance to the French Revolution. Burke, after all, not only attacked the French Revolution, but he defended the commercial English Revolution and princely Indian institutions with the same kind of conservative arguments. Nor was conservatism, Huntington thought, an autonomous system of ideas universally valid, such as order, balance, and moderation, which any intelligent person might embrace at any time. Because it did not appear in history, he thought, all the time, or even randomly. It appeared, conservatism appeared, at times of great political upheaval. Conservatism, Huntington thought, was the system of ideas employed to defend established institutions when they came under fundamental attack. Not every attack should or could be resisted, of course, but to preserve the fundamentals, change on secondary issues might sometimes be accepted. And once a social system had been decisively overthrown, the conservatism might counsel acceptance of the new status quo and even defend it against future attack. But as Huntington himself put it, when the foundations of society are threatened, the conservative ideology reminds men of the necessity of some institutions and the desirability of existing ones. Now, at first hearing, this definition sounds not particularly impressive and familiar enough, but that's deceptive, because embedded in it are 2 quite novel points. First, he makes the point that when a country is at ease with itself, conservatism is largely unnecessary. It will exist as a set of prudent maxims. Existing institutions embody the wisdom of previous generations. Prejudice, experience, and habit are often better guides than reason, logic, and abstractions. But these statements, these maxims, will have little political purchase or influence. It is when something like the French Revolution comes along that these maxims become vital political truths. The impulse to conservatism, he thought, arose not from the intellectual tradition behind the philosopher, but from the social challenge in front of him. Men are driven to conservatism by the shock of events, by the horrible feeling that society or an institution of which they have approved or simply taken for granted might suddenly cease to exist. His second novel point is that when political institutions come under such an attack, it is often hard, maybe impossible, to defend them in terms of their own justifying principles, let us say freedom or equality or prosperity or whatever. The radical critic can always find a gap between the noble ideal and the practical achievement, the inadequate practice, and the defender is then driven onto the defensive. It is in these circumstances that the defender resorts, often against his will, to conservative arguments. The magnitude of the problems involved, the impossibility of changing habits by legislative fiat, the tensions caused by too rapid social change. In other words, if a liberal, will drop the language of liberalism, of equality and freedom, and turn to predominantly conservative arguments when liberalism is attacked. Applying this logic to the new conservatism of the American 50s, Huntington argued, in effect, it's only half a conservatism. Those new conservatives who were mainly concerned to oppose, international communism as a fundamental threat to America's liberal institutions, Huntington endorsed that. The threat was real, and therefore so was the conservatism. Domestically, however, he felt that America in the 50s, under this liberal dispensation of the day, was in a state of such prosperous contentment that there was no real challenge to existing institutions, and the new conservatives were left flailing at ideological windmills rather than at real enemies. But Huntington did not believe that would be the case for long. America's liberal institutions, he thought, would eventually come under sustained radical attack, and then it would be liberals who stepped forward to defend them with a truly conservative conservatism. Now, that was a very remarkable and prescient prediction. It was slightly flawed. Huntington expected the challenge to be international rather than domestic, and even here he could claim the Vietnam War as a catalyst for what happened. But the prescience was that a decade after he wrote, the 60s radicals issued a comprehensive denunciation of American liberalism and its central institutions, namely the university, as oppressive. Many liberals capitulated, we forget that now, and embraced the radical critique as their own. But a minority rejected it forcefully and developed a politics built around defending liberalism against the radical challenge, with conservative arguments, and neoconservatism was born. 50 years later, the neoconservatives have been subsumed into a wider conservatism that also includes libertarians, moral traditionalists, cultural conservatives, and nationalists. It may well be the most decisive result of the 60s revolution was actually to give the United States a rich, varied, and sophisticated conservatism that under Reagan went on to win the 1980 election and the Cold War. But that, like conservatism and that conservatism, there and elsewhere, is now uncertain, divided, and in the doldrums. Is there a challenge today comparable to that either of the 60s revolution or the French Revolution that might spark a revival of conservatism in America and elsewhere? And at first glance, the answer isn't clear what it is. What is happening today that most resembles the slow spread of Jacobinism that led to the French Revolution? Any answer got to be, to some degree, speculative. But my own answer is that the next great challenge can be seen in the West and throughout the West in the gradual undermining of democracy and the shift of power and decision-making from institutions that are accountable to the voters to those that are either accountable to no one but themselves or that inhabit a constitutional limbo where they cannot easily be held to account. I think we see the harbingers of this challenge in our world in three developments. The first is the shift of power from legislatures to bureaucratic agencies and the courts, brought about by overgovernment. The shift of power from legislatures to bureaucratic agencies and the courts, brought about by overgovernment. The shift of power from nation-states to supranational bodies, and the development of anti-democratic ideas that, lagging behind events, serve to justify these relatively new political practices and to defend the new loci of power. The first of these problems is familiar. As early as 1929, Lord Justice Hewitt in England warned in The New Despotism that the practice of delegated legislation was allowing bureaucrats to make law without democratic accountability. A few years later, in the United States, conservatives were criticizing the alphabet soup of federal agencies created by Roosevelt in the New Deal. These also had the power to issue regulations with the force of law, sometimes of criminal law, on the basis of extremely vague legislation. Today, both countries, indeed almost all countries, are governed by a regulatory state, which daily manufactures what are in effect new laws determining such matters as the amount of lead in car emissions, the proper ethnic and gender composition of a small company's workforce, and the level of rents in New York City. And regulation, of course, is at the heart of the European Union in the process of harmonization and the single market. Now, I don't want to get hysterical on these points. Many of us would feel that many of these regulations, uncontroversial. They plainly proceed from the supra-legislation, and they're necessary. But not all. Some are contentious. Some would surprise the writers of the original law, and the penalties for violating these regulations are often heavy. My favourite absurd example is the railroad cop who some years ago boarded the evening train, commuter train, from Grand Central Station in New York and arrested 4 men for playing cards. These men were read their rights, they were fingerprinted, thrown into the cells. There was apparently a railroad regulation banning gaming devices, but the outcry when this news got out was so loud that the following day they were all released, got an apology from the governor of the state, and were given $30,000 each in compensation. And finally they were assured that the policewoman's action was not the start of a crackdown on card playing. She had in fact boarded the train in search of smokers. Now, we've become so used to the regulatory state that although we still notice these absurdities, we're not outraged by them. And although we notice its illiberal features, we no longer think of it as being offensive to democratic principle. But conservatives should constantly underline the weak democratic credentials of that kind of extensive regulation. Point out how arbitrary it is. In one case, a company in the United States, a trucking company, was being attacked by one department for not employing disabled drivers and by another department for doing so. And of course, where possible, we should alter alternatives. Now, although regulation won't be ever halted by such opposition, it will at least be kept to a sensible minimum. Now, it's sometimes suggested that the remedy for the growth of bureaucratic regulation is the review of the courts and an increase in their oversight. Once, however, judges begin to review the merits of legislation or ministerial decisions, they almost, within a very short time, overstep their legitimate boundaries and start either legislating or governing. And that is happening with increasing frequency. Judges in England, contrary to their old image, are positively frisky with power. And we, in Europe, are already hearing arguments and phrases from the American debate on judicial intervention in politics. And those phrases bear some brief examination. One is, for example, frequently, this is a line in New York Times editorials, minority rights must be protected against majority rule. It sounds very reasonable. But the opposite of majority rule is not minority rights, but minority rule. And we have no good reason to assume that a ruling minority, in this case judges, will be especially tender to the rights of other minorities. And even if we had, there must be a way in which the majority can restrain judges from infringing its own rights by inventive interpretations of the law. And I think this is one of the points that Burke taught conservatives, in the end, unaccountable power not restrained by other authority, will inevitably be abused. And if judges gradually acquire the power to overturn existing laws and to make new ones under the guise of constitutional review, they will inevitably abuse that power in time, as I would argue they did in the Supreme Court in America that redefined marriage. And that's not just my judgment. In the last 30 years, American judgments have desegregated entire school systems, ordered the release of violent criminals from overcrowded prisons, levied taxes in order to increase local educational spending, removed a legislative prohibition on ethnic and gender quotas, and then made such quotas mandatory, redrawn electoral boundaries, and then laid down rules for drawing them up in future, set aside the laws of 50 states on abortion by making it a federal right, declared nude dancing to be a protected speech under the First Amendment. What one wonders is the girl saying. Compelled local authorities to put low-income housing in middle-class areas, and much, much else that was formerly thought to be in the domain of electoral democratic politics. Any American who wants to exercise real power over how people live would be far better advised to apply for a Supreme Court clerkship than to run for Congress. Now, let me turn now to the shift of power from the nation to supranational bodies. And right away, I want to draw a distinction between internationalism and supranationalism or transnationalism, a distinction that is vital but customarily glossed over. Supranational organizations, the European Union is one, of course, are hostile to national sovereignty in principle. They seek to bind member states to accept majority decisions on unknowable matters in advance. They will accept opt-outs from collective decisions only on a temporary basis. They are hostile to rules like the unanimity principle, and they allow no mechanism for withdrawal, or they make it very difficult, as is currently happening to the British in the Brexit negotiations. In effect, supranational or transnational organizations make the nation state into their agents on such matters as they see fit, and joining them irrevocably involves a loss of sovereignty. On the other hand, international organizations, NATO is a good example, are forums for the exercise of national sovereignty. That is, they define very narrowly the future collective decisions which will be binding, for example, Article 5, which permits NATO member states to defend an ally under attack. Otherwise, they allow member states to abstain from collective decisions, as in the so-called idea of the coalitions of the willing. They often employ the unanimity principle, and they acknowledge that nations can exercise their sovereignty by leaving. In effect, a nation-state makes international organizations its agents in specific endeavors, and joining those endeavors is therefore an exercise of national sovereignty. So supranationalism and international are not really the same thing. They're quite different, and their relationship to the nation-state is very different. For nation-states, which supranational institutions seek to supersede and replace, are the building blocks of democratic internationalism. If democracy is, as I would argue, if democracy is intimately bound up with the nation-state, then organizations whose decisions must be ratified by national parliaments can lay claim to democratic accountability at one remove. The same claim cannot be made by organizations whose decisions are binding upon the parliaments of member states. This problem, I think, applies in particular to the European Union as it evolves towards a new form of polity, in effect, a multilingual liberal empire. On numerous occasions, the EU has conceded that its ruling arrangements have a democratic deficit. Indeed, one distinguished European Commissioner, Lord Ralph Dahrendorf, once said that if the EU were to apply to join the EU, it would not be accepted on the grounds that it doesn't meet the democratic principles. For admission, that mattered less, obviously, when the EU was responsible for a modest amount of law and regulation in its member states. But that was several years ago. Given the gradual disappearance of the veto and the advance to greater EU centralization, Brussels now determines a very large percentage, estimates differ, of the laws that govern us in our different states. This surrender of sovereignty in this process is gradual, but it's cumulative and it doesn't seem to stop. As the scope of Brussels expands, therefore, so democracy ceases to determine more and more government decisions. My own view is that the only way to reverse this aspect of democracy's decline is to restore powers from Brussels to national parliaments. But that's not what's happening, and it's something that you might want to discuss tonight. Now, the two challenges to democracy that I've been discussing so far are anti-democratic in effect rather than in intent. That's not what these things were started to do. And indeed, those pushing them along would generally be horrified to be told that they were undermining what is now widely regarded as the only morally respectable form of government. But the paradox is that at the very moment when democracy was celebrating its victory over Soviet totalitarianism, and when some observers were declaring that democracy no longer faced a plausible ideological competitor in world politics, an intellectual challenge has emerged that quite self-consciously attacks democracy itself, and does so in the name of liberal democracy. As the issue, now that may sound odd, but there is at the moment a very vigorous debate developing with contributions from people like Richard Legutko in Poland, and groups of intellectuals in the United States, John Fonte there, and because as the issue is normally debated and discussed in television programs, the battle is alleged to be one between liberal democracy and populism. And of course, because the people supporting liberal democracy in this case tend to be the powers that be, their view of things tends to be one we are given more or less uncritically. But I want to examine what in this context populism means and what liberal democracy means. Populism is, everyone can see, I think, not a neutral, dispassionate description. It's what they call a boo word, employed to discredit those called populists. It seeks to end debate rather than to advance it or to clarify it, and we should be obviously aware of that. Liberal democracy, too, is a protean concept that also needs clarifying, and that's what I'll do first. In the relatively recent past, the days of FDR and Churchill, JFK and Macmillan, Reagan and Thatcher, liberal democracy meant free, competitive elections in an atmosphere of free speech, free assembly, and a free press. How could an election be free unless, without free speech, to allow full discussion of the issues? Now, to be sure, there were additional restraints on majority rule then, but they were modest and few. In recent years, however, as I argued above, liberalism has come to mean the proliferation of liberal institutions, the courts, supranational bodies, charters of rights, and so on. Under this dispensation, liberal democracy becomes the undemocratic imposition of liberal policies by bodies that are not accountable directly to the voters. This shift of power is now almost a constitutional convention. We simply don't notice it. The longer it continues unnoticed, however, the more it will influence law and regulation. The more, then, that electoral or parliamentary majorities will cease to be the decisive decision makers, and the more they will become one among several stakeholders around the table. Majoritarian democracy in these conditions mutates into a system that Hudson Institute's John Fonte calls post-democracy, in which elites and the institutions they control exercise more power than the voters and their elected representatives. Now, I should have at this point a diagram which made it all clear. But I'll just explain it briefly, which may not be as clear, unfortunately. Think of this chart. There's a line showing the spectrum of constitutional powers. In the center of the line is majoritarian democracy, or you could call it liberal majoritarian democracy, as it would have been understood by Churchill, JFK, Reagan, and so on. At one end of the spectrum, you have post-democracy. At the other end of the spectrum, you have populism. As liberal restraints on democratic majorities increase in number and importance, the system moves towards post-democracy. As these liberal restraints decrease in importance and number, the system moves towards populism. But every action stimulates a reaction, so the more power has shifted to liberal institutions in recent years, and as democratic majorities have become weaker as a result, the more that populism has emerged to complain that the majority the will of the voters is being ignored, and to demand that it be more respected and the restraints on it removed. That is what the recent upsurge of populism represents. And theorists across the spectrum themselves have come to understand the fact. It was a Dutch liberal political scientist, Kasmuder, who pointed out some years ago, I quote, "Populism is an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. It criticizes the exclusion of important issues from the political agenda by elites, and it calls for their repoliticization." But an example would be the idea that central banks should be completely independent and make their decisions without the government having a say. How can that possibly be the case when monetary policy is a decisive political importance? I mean, to prosperity. I would say the only circumstances in which you can justify that, and I'm a liberal on these questions, the only way you can justify that is if there really is a universal technical agreement among experts that the way to go forward is by a particular set of policies. But there never is such an agreement. And when the euro was set up, yes, the majority of economists and government and in the private sector favoured it. But two economists who didn't favour it were Milton Friedman and Joseph Stiglitz from the left and right on the spectrum. And they have turned out to be right. So the idea of simply taking issues out of politics because the experts know best, that is a fatuous idea ultimately. Well, not even ultimately, quite soon. But there is an equal and opposite truth to that. If majority rule is to remain the driving force of democracy, then populism and populist issues will have to be absorbed within traditional democratic debate and made subject to its conventions. I would say that the UK referendum on Brexit did achieve that. Hasn't achieved everything by any means. But once the voters had made their decision, and once the government had accepted it, it became an orthodox part of ordinary political debate, with the government proposing measures to implement it, the opposition suggesting amendments, the courts hearing cases to ensure that Brexit was pursued within the rules of the political game, and so on and so forth. I would also say, as a side issue, that UKIP saw, as a result of Brexit becoming part of the political system, UKIP saw its support drain away, since the mainstream parties adopted its signature issue and began carrying it into practical effect. Well, one did, the other only pretended to do so. That's important. I might ask the question, are populist parties here for good? Or are they likely to fade away as other parties take up their issues? Either may happen. The populist parties may end up just being way stations for discontented who may not know it, but who are on their way to new political loyalties and to join new political parties. At the moment, as we know, throughout the Western world, highly educated voters are moving to liberal parties on the left, and blue-collar workers are moving to conservative parties on the right. Once we take these important developments into account, it becomes possible to craft a definition of populism that is not simply a way of abusing a political party or jeering at its arguments without meeting them seriously. As I mentioned, Professor Muda has given us the definition that populism is a liberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. Another such definition was unintentionally revealed by Professor Theodor Papas in Hungary when he said populist parties embrace democracy but not liberalism. Then the next sentence is the key one. Liberalism without democracy is not a combination found in real-life politics today. And that discloses the definition we need, because liberalism without democracy is, in fact, as I've just tried to argue, the system of government to which the West has been moving since 1989, and populism resists it. And however we juggle things, the main choice between the voters is increasingly going to be between some type of liberal or progressive elitism and democratic populism. Now, that's not, in a sense, formally the choice at present in most countries, but it is a choice to which the politics of all of the major countries, it seems to me at least, is now beginning to tend. Where should conservatism and conservatives stand? I think we have little choice but to favour democratic populism over progressive elitism. That's not what most conservatives would have thought throughout history, but I'm going to justify it, I hope. Well, I'm going to justify it by looking at French politics. The Macron phenomenon has had one very, very good and useful and interesting effect. It's provoked a lot of very interesting French intellectuals into thinking anew about politics. And one of the most important and interesting of them is Pierre Monon, Director of Studies at the Sciences Po in Paris, in an article which you can find in the English language version was in a magazine called American Affairs. And he argued that populism was going to be gradually absorbed into a new party system, but it was going to be absorbed in a negative and even destructive way. He sees a new system emerging ultimately from the fact that both traditional parties of left and right in France, both of them converted to the European idea in the 1970s. Now, in becoming European and modern, the left abandoned its original constituency of social class, notably the working class, which it always championed. In making the same transition, the right abandoned its constituency of nation and nationalism. Those of their respective voters who continued to feel loyal to class or nation and to the loyalties arising from them then became a source of real embarrassment to their old parties and an obstacle to the policies that the European idea demanded. These policies were a set of rules for harmonizing the EU's economic arrangements, the political commitments, and even its national democratic character. Sorry, I missed my point. Yes. The policies increasingly were going to be determined not in national parliaments, but by bureaucrats in Brussels, and once determined, they were not easily subject to amendment or repeal by national parties responding to the democratic objections of their electorates. Now, all that sounds a little abstract, but the brutal treatment of Greece by the EU Troika, overriding its democratic choices by fiat, will make the point. Those who object, clinging to class or nation, therefore must then be treated by their parties as people to be sent into the wilderness, slandered by their former leaders as various kinds of deplorables, extremists, populists, unrespectables, as bad as terrorists, and so on. Some of these deplorables then break away and found new parties representing their old loyalties and sympathies. Others cross the spectrum to join parties that now seem more sympathetic to them. And when these defections occur, the leaders of the mainstream parties, now the centre, begin to see their common interests more clearly. If you notice what's happening in the European Parliament, the parties of left and right, the centre, the EPP and the Socialist Bloc, now act, so to speak, as different wings of the same political movement. Now, Manon's essay is a rich and complex one, which I think you'd all enjoy reading. And if these trends continue unabated, he thinks they will lead to a competition between an unrespectable national populism and an arrogant cosmopolitan centrism, or to put it in his own words, between populist demagogy and the fanaticism of the centre. And as I say, we already see this emerging in bare bones in the European Parliament, where the left and right form a coalition against the extremes, that is, everyone else. They do so in defence of European integration, globalization, supranationalism, overlapping jurisdictions, more or less open borders, extreme individualism in morality, and cosmopolitan values, and against what they think of as xenophobia, national sovereignty, respect for traditional cultures, any communitarian sense of belonging, and democratic patriotism. And they are beginning to be the dividing lines of politics. Now, it's not hard to see in these two lists of issues an emerging competition of class interests corresponding to the distinction by David Goodhart in Britain of the two new groups of people he calls anywheres and somewheres. The somewheres being local people with only modest skills, but rooted in their local community, and the somewheres, and the anywheres, people with who are highly mobile because they have intellectual skills which they can employ anywhere. Macron's victory in France was achieved actually through populist methods, but it was a victory for the emerging centrist consensus, the anywheres, in which Manon sees great dangers. And I will now cite two of those dangers in particular. First, the new political system that Manon foresees would replace an earlier one of left versus right, in which the battle was over how to share the economic spoils. That would be replaced by a system in which the battle is over questions like the ones I've mentioned: immigration control, gay marriage, the civil rights of religion, multiculturalism, the dilution of citizenship, the transfer of sovereignty to authorities outside the nation, and the loss of any sense of democratic ownership of political decisions. Battles over how to share wealth and income, they're not easy to solve, but they're far easier to solve than disputes over morality, ethnicity, citizenship, and allegiance, which, as we've seen in other parts of the world, can be dead toxic. His second point, which I want to emphasize here, is that in the old left versus right world, both sides essentially accepted the legitimacy of the other. They didn't sing out "Vive la différence," but they did, as Manon points out, acknowledge that the other side of politics was going to win occasionally. And when they did, when the other side won, they had the right to govern the country for a specified period. He observes, and I think rightly, though people may quarrel with this, that the centrist establishment consensus in Europe does not really accept the right of the extremes to come to power. And in the Brexit debate, we see arguments against the carrying through the referendum decision, which actually straightforwardly attack the concept of democracy and argue that experts know better and should be given very much a progressive idea from the 20s there, and should be given the right to overrule the people. If the other side does win, if the wrong side wins, they think it's legitimate to use supranational legal and political powers to constrain and even to oust them. See what's happened this week to Hungary in the European Parliament. See what's happening elsewhere with the attempt to impose refugee quotas on reluctant member states. What this new party system offers, therefore, is a much more partisan and bitter battle over questions that are more difficult to solve and more resistant to compromise than the world in which we all grew up. And contrary to bien-pensant progressive opinion, he thinks populist demagogy is less to blame for the bitterness and intractability of the political battleground than is the fanaticism of the centre. So conservatism in these circumstances should bend itself to bringing the populists into conventional politics, to add vigour to the democratic debate, but also to be restrained by it. Now, until recently, conservatives have been the people most sceptical of democracy. We liked restraints on the democratic will and institutions that would restrain the mob. What we are seeing today, however, is that if you give non-democratic institutions the power to restrain democracy, then they will sometimes use it to correct democracy. Their powers will be abused because, as Burke saw, it's in the nature of unaccountable power to be abused. Also, we were mistaken in thinking that judges and other elites would confine themselves to prudently dampening the passions of the mob. Those elites turn out to have passions of their own, on, for example, gender theory. And by and large, those passions are not shared by the people nor by conservatives. They are the rationalizing passions that Burke diagnosed and excoriated 2 centuries ago. And they are, in my view, a greater danger to liberty than the opinions of the mass of voters who, being closer to the hardships of life, have a greater sense of reality and limits. My prescription, therefore, is that conservatives should embrace democracy with more satisfaction, with more enthusiasm than before, and keep our objections muted. We should question whether any restraint other than a delaying power with its implied request to think again should be imposed on democratically elected assemblies. It is the voters who should pass judgment on those assemblies. We should mount a clear, vigorous, and principled opposition to the anti-democratic ideas now being heard in the British debate on Brexit. We should seek the return of powers that have been surrendered by national parliaments to Brussels and Strasbourg. We should be inspired by a straightforward belief that democracy is worth preserving because, with all its faults, as Churchill saw, it's better than any of the alternatives. The stakes seem to me to be high. Either we retain a vigorous democratic polity, or we find ourselves living, not altogether unpleasantly, in a stifling bureaucratic state in which all our wants are provided for except liberty and except a democratic debate that actually influences political decisions. The second outcome, the opposite outcome, this outcome is in a way a revival of statist socialism under other names. And that's quite a possible development. Many social forces, including apparently forgetful or undereducated young people, are pushing us towards that outcome. I'm beginning to think, if Marx were here, he would say that socialism repeats itself. The first time as genocide, the second time as therapy. Am I being too gloomy? I hope so. Remember, however, the last words of the Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, just before, to his Hungarian chef, just before he went before the firing squad. He said to the chef, "You thought it would never come to this. You see now that you were wrong."
So thank you, John, for that eloquent talk. It's given us much to think about. Your remarks on democracy and reviving a culture of democracy, I think, are welcome here. We have a very important and I think significant initiative to change the election law in Croatia, which is meeting great resistance from the elites. So what you've said is very timely to our circumstances. So I'll open the floor and briefly introduce yourself if you have a question. Yes?
I'm Boris Vidovic, I'm a retired teacher. Okay, thank you for illuminating the lecture. But I'm afraid a little bit more gloomer, my perception of democracy is much gloomer than yours experience, because I've been living in this country, which was a socialist. So I wonder if the key elements for democracy, people's sovereignty and equality, have been recently characterized like zombies for many democracies in the world. If you take a look at the political party programs of the center left and of the center right parties, they look almost alike in substance. Even the Liberal Party in England never mentioned equality, only say choice for prosaic reasons, choice for school, so choice for doctor, etc. As the programs are almost the same, the voters have no choice. They have votes, but not a voice. As the people, demos, are being more and more, in a way, prevented by the small group of elite called kratis, democratis, that is one who the rule, are intervening in daily public affairs, so people can take part in taking decision. And this causes social tensions and conflicts, which might implode or explode in societies. Do you think that this kind of democracy will bring peace and stability, or cause instability, or even wars and destruction in the future?
Well, thank you. I mean, you raised a number of important points. I probably won't be able to deal with all of them, but I will try to deal with the most important ones. On the question of equality, when we say we want equality, obviously different people at different points on the political spectrum mean different things by it. The equality that I strongly believe in and would wish to preserve is legal equality, the legal equality of all systems, with no legal privileges on the one hand. And obviously, to give that some substantive content, I think there would be necessary, under certain clear rules, to allow poorer people to have some access to public funds for their defence or for certain actions. Now, we have to be quite limited there because we don't want an overly legalistic society in which everyone is suing everybody else. But equality before the law is important, and we must try to make it a reality as well as a principle. That means, of course, that legal equality is not the same as substantive economic equality, and I don't think that's an important matter at all. I think the concentration on equality of that kind is greatly mistaken. Now, I am in favour, very strongly, of relief for poverty and the encouragement of people who lack agency, as the saying goes, who don't seem to have the abilities to compete in our society, and think the rest of us have got some kind of obligations to them to learn, to teach them how to compete. Some of those obligations can be met by private actions, and important that should happen, and there might be some public element in that too. But I'm certainly not in favour of attempting to legislate for substantive economic equality. And by the way, any nation that does that, in addition to failing, it also produces a very strong political inequality, because the people who make the decisions about economic equality have to produce economic equality have to acquire more and more political power over the rest of us. And again, that's undesirable. Now, another point you made was that if the parties are all saying the same thing, then you don't really have a choice. And my view on that is that there is some truth for that, and most of the time that's a temporary state of affairs, because one party sees an advantage in taking a certain position and goes after it, and another party will respond therefore. Also, individual political entrepreneurs in politics rise as a result of exploiting issues that the major parties are keeping quiet about. And what we've just been describing in the talk, or what I've been describing in the talk, a situation in which the parties kept issues out of politics. In the end, that broke down. And now there is discussion of immigration, mass immigration, and multiculturalism, and the euro. And people have risen to power, and parties have become governments as a result of challenging what had been a bipartisan political consensus. That's not happened as yet, effectively, within European institutions. But let's wait and see what happens in the European elections next May. And finally, as a matter of principle, when dealing with situations in which there is a kind of an agreement of the parties and a substantial and settled opinion in the electorate that disagrees, then I think that is where referendums come into play. The referendums are there as a method for for getting the political expression of ideas that the parties themselves don't want. It takes a great deal of effort to persuade the parties to hold referendums, therefore, but as we see, sometimes the pressure becomes irresistible.
Okay,
we have time. Sorry, we have time for 2 quick questions, and then we have to commit. Yes.
Yeah. Mr. O'Sullivan, thank you for your presentation. My name is Petar Čurić. I am initiator and organizer of Branding Croatia conference. I know that this is not a specific question about the topic that you were covering, but I'm sure that you will be able to respond accordingly. If I'm not wrong, you're director of the
Danube Institute.
Danube Institute in Hungary.
Yeah.
So my quick question is, what are the 3 goals and reasons for the existence of this institute? And my second question, quick one, is how can Croatia benefit from the existence of your institute in the future?
Well, I'll try to think of that last one, but let me just say,
We're already benefiting. Hopefully.
Thank you. We always say that we stand for 3 things. We are conservative in cultural, historical questions. We are classical liberal in economics, and we are Atlanticist in foreign policy. And they're the three statements and positions we take up as an institute. But we also say that whenever we hold a conference or host a lecture, that we invite respectable democratic opponents to these ideas to discuss, so that we have genuine debate. Because this is a criticism of Central Europe, which you may or may not like, but I feel that democratic partisan politics are so fierce in Central Europe because there isn't enough debate. Because if once you have debate and you have to confront the other person and ideas across a table or in a lecture hall, then I think we begin to get understanding across the spectrum, even if we don't get agreement, which of course we'll never reach agreement on these things. So I think that those four things really: conservative, classical liberal, Atlanticist, and believers in debate. And to give weight to so that you can see I'm telling the truth, we had one of our most successful conferences was entitled "What Future for Europe's Left?" And we had representatives of left-wing parties from over Europe, all over Western and Eastern Europe, around the table discussing this. We had one conservative on the platform, and he had to remain silent until at the end of the conference he got to give his response, which, by the way, it was a good response, and everybody on the other side thoroughly enjoyed it. So it was a very, very good conference. And by the way, the predictions that the people there made about what was going to happen in the elections that have now all occurred were extraordinarily accurate. So people were being very candid, and we want to do more of that.
So, because of time restraints, we have time for one more question. One more, yes?
My name is Denis Danicic. I'm a grad student here in Zagreb. I'm originally from, I was born in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but I grew up in the United States. And the question that I wanted to ask you that's interested me, I've been politically involved since I was 16 years old. I'm 24 now, I'm still young. I don't have a lot of experience, and something that I'd like to ask someone that has more experience in this and a whole lifetime of seeing political dispute, especially on the conservative angle. I've always felt that conservatives, as compared to liberals, in terms of political parties and in terms of consensus, are much more diverse and aggressive towards each other than liberals are. If you look at conservatives, for example, in the United States, my home state of Arizona, way before Trump, the first real debate when we noticed a massive division within our party was over John McCain, whether or not to censure him. And now today in America, we have super nationalists fighting ethno-nationalists, civic nationalists, neoconservatives, neoliberals, economic centrists, business conservatives, etc. And they're all really clashing with each other. And you have conservatives, for example, in Texas, supporting the Democratic candidate for Senate over Ted Cruz, Peter O'Rourke, which to me is absolutely ridiculous. That we're supporting other parties over ourselves because of what to me are really slight ideological disagreements. If you look at Croatia, for example, you look at all the political parties on the right that we have. HDZ, you have HSP, there's like 20 HSPs. HSP, 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 HSP. I can go all night. You have Nova Desnica, Hrast, etc. So why is it that that doesn't happen on the left? I've never seen a division in the United States amongst Democrats, amongst liberals or leftists. I've never seen that intense division. Today you have progressives fighting socialists, but it's not intense. They agree, I guess, within closed doors, and they present this public image. And in Croatia, I think the left, in terms of SDP, the party's falling apart, but in general is much more organized and much more agreeable than conservatives are amongst each other.
Yes.
So why do you think that occurs?
Well, let me say that I have really 2 points to reply to. When I entered politics first, I may be the only person in the world who lied about his age in order to join the Young Conservatives. So I was interested in the word go, and this was the late 50s, and in those days, in British politics, the common argument was the Conservatives, they're so self-disciplined, they debate honestly behind closed doors, but they maintain an unruffled, placid surface of agreement. Whereas we Labour people, they would say, we're always quarrelling, and that's why we lose. Why can't we be more disciplined? Well, the answer, of course, is that situation changed considerably as a result of people emerging in the Conservative Party who actually wanted to take a far stronger pro-market position and an anti-Soviet position. And as a result, the 1970s and 80s, which Robin and I remember well because we were involved in all those quarrels, the party was a constant state of internal debate, argument, and even civil war. But they were the years in which we achieved more than anyone had ever expected, both in terms of the revival of the British economy and the victory of the Cold War, in which Mrs. Thatcher played an unusually important role for the head of a single European country. So the answer is, therefore, that first of all, these things change. Sometimes it's the left, sometimes the right that's out. But it tends to happen when there are really important issues coming onto the agenda which divide a political party. And I would say at the moment that the post-war pattern of European politics, in which is fundamentally there's a socialist party, there's a mainstream conservative party, mainly economic in its proposals, with perhaps a small liberal party in the middle, and the tiny little parties on either end of the spectrum, extreme and left and right. That's gone. It's going. It hasn't gone. And it's going because of the things we were talking about. And if you look at the French elections, actually demonstrate this far more clearly than anything else, because in the first round of the French presidential election last year, you had 4 almost equal blocs. You had a far left position, Jean-Luc Mélenchon. You had Macron, who was a kind of covert socialist but centrist. You had the François Fillon of the centre right, and you had Marine Le Pen. They were almost equal in the first round. Of course, once 2 people were eliminated, the votes went separately. But I think that there is a fight on left and right. Where we have the advantage is that the socialist decline started about 3 years ago, maybe longer, maybe before that. And the parties have been losing ground. I mean, the French and German socialist parties have all but disappeared, and they have disappeared in Italy. The centre-right is still relatively important, still occupies an important position, and if it's sensible, what it will do is it will court the national populists, bring them in to an alliance, which is what's happened in Austria and what's happened in Hungary. And I think that the West, and I think it could happen in Britain if the party was sensible enough to insist on a Brexit that brought all of the UKIP people in. The opportunity is there for the right. But at the moment, in Britain at least, and probably other places, they're not seeing these possibilities with the clarity that Orban and Kurz and Kaczynski have seen them in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. And therefore, we can't expect maybe the good result that we would if you had better strategists on the right. So we need more strategy. I don't mind disagreement. But thanks.
Before we convene, if you don't mind, John, we'll take one more question.
Sure.
So from the young gentleman, you're last. Go ahead.
Marko Parajic. So I have 2 brief questions.
Quick, very quick.
Is there a difference between European and Anglo-Saxon conservatism? And second question is, what's your opinion about conservative revolution in Weimar Republic and author like Oswald Spengler and Stinger, Karl Schmidt?
Well, on the last bit, I don't really know enough to talk with any great confidence or authority. But sorry, what was the first bit of it? Yeah.
The continental.
Yeah,
Europe.
oh, absolutely, there is. Now, the English-speaking world is a cultural unity, much more so today than it was 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, the same television programs, the same newspapers, the same magazines, the same internet. We all talk to each other, much more. And by the way, years ago in the 60s, The Economist asked the question, who did the British ring up on Christmas Day? In those days, calls were very expensive, and Christmas Day was the day where you rang up your relatives who lived abroad. Where did the Brits ring? They rang Australia, Canada, New Zealand, to some degree a little South Africa, and the United States. And that kind of cultural linkage exists today. That means that culturally, the English-speaking world tends to see, I don't know exaggerate, but it tends to see political questions in the same way, through the same lens. That has important effects in two ways. One is our nationalists tend to be far more likely free trade nationalists than protectionists. There are protectionists, but free trade nationalism is much easier within the English-speaking world because liberal economics is invented in England, and to some extent the rest of the English-speaking world has gone along with that. Not completely, don't want to exaggerate, but that's the case. The second is the English-speaking world consists there is such a thing, which there isn't in Germany now, less in France, most places. You don't have a war party. By which I mean you don't have a party that is prepared to think seriously all the time about defence and about what's necessary. Whereas in the English-speaking world, there is what I would call a muscular liberalism. It's strongest in the United States because of the responsibilities America has, but you get it in Australia too, which has fought with the United States in every single one of the wars in the 20th century. You see it less in Canada because the relationship with America is slightly more neurotic, and that means that these countries tend to look at questions in the same light, and that's why you will find that when, for example, there was a call on people to come and fight in various parts of the world, they're often the first people. I was amazed to discover the other day, I was listening to an American military man, and he says the most important, powerful, brilliant, skilled and courageous special forces in the world are from New Zealand. And I've always thought of New Zealand as practically, as near as almost as pacifist as Germany these days. But it's not true, and so that's the reason. There is a real cultural difference. That the Atlantic is smaller than the Channel, but nonetheless, there is a conservatism that crosses the spectrum. And I mean, if you're interested, look at the works of Emmanuel Todd, who identifies how different forms of liberalism, and therefore of conservatism, arise from different methods of family formation and structure. And he sees the English one, which has been transmitted to their former colonies and to the US, as being radically different to those in France, in Germany, and in other parts of Europe.
Okay, so I want to thank you, John, for accepting our invitation and speaking to us this evening. I think John deserves another round of applause.
Thank you very much.
If you would like to be on our invitation list for future events, leave your name and email on your way out, and you'll be getting them directly, not just through Facebook and other media. So we'll convene now. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you soon at our future events.
Very good.
Okay.